we're going to go live. Okay, hello, we're going to go live on Facebook. In a second. On my page. Moms Across America. Toxic Legacy. I have to name it right now. Okay, we are live on Facebook. Hi, everyone. It is
Hi
such a
there.
treat. Hi, it's such a treat to have you, Dr. Stephanie Seneff, all the way from Hawaii with us today. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Weather's beautiful here. We're not getting the heat wave that people are getting elsewhere in the country. So
Yes, well, we're so glad you're doing well. We are so excited to talk about your new book, Toxic Legacy: How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and the Environment. Yes,
there it
thank you. I'm
is.
so glad you have a copy. There it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. We have a new article out on our website. I'll just screen share so people can see what that looks like. I had the privilege and honor of reading this book several months ago in order to give a review, and I have a full review on our website. We hope that people will check that out and share it. There are links directly to Amazon where you can buy this book. You can see I purchased mine just yesterday. Wanted to make sure that it helps to boost it up to the top of the list. It's now a #1 bestseller in the agriculture industry. And David Perlmutter, MD, says that Toxic Legacy will stand shoulder to shoulder with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. This is unquestionably one of the most important books of our time. And Boston Globe says, urgent and eye-opening, this book serves as a loud and clear alarm. And Kirkus Review says this is a game changer that we would be foolish to ignore. So Dr. Seneff, I have to ask right from the get-go, there are hundreds of different types of pesticides that we spray on our food supply. Now not you and I, that farmers spray on our food supply, and these residues get into our bodies. There are thousands of chemicals that our children and our families are exposed to every day. Why glyphosate? Why is glyphosate such a big deal? What makes it so different? How come we're focused so much on glyphosate and not a myriad of other chemicals? What is the big deal about glyphosate?
You're right. There are many, many chemicals, and they're all affecting our health, and we need to get rid of all of them. I think we really want to go back to an organic lifestyle in the way we grow food. We shouldn't put any chemicals on our food. And I'm not asking to replace glyphosate with atrazine, which is also known to be very bad. Atrazine causes male frogs to turn into females, even though they have only male genes. It's incredible. They can even reproduce. So atrazine is messing up the sexual development of the frogs, and probably of us as well. And it's causing all kinds of problems, definitely an endocrine disruptor. So atrazine is bad too, but glyphosate is worse for two reasons, in my opinion. Number one is we think it's safe. So people don't know they need to be careful when they use it. It's completely unregulated. Anybody can go down to the garden store and buy some glyphosate, Roundup, and use it on the dandelions in their yard or on the weeds growing in their walkway. Lots of people are doing that. They might have their kids playing outside and not worrying about it because this is so safe. We're being told it's a wonderful, wonderful chemical, so fantastic for agriculture because it kills all plants except those who've been engineered to resist it. And it's completely harmless to humans. This is what we're hearing. It's a wonderful herbicide, completely harmless to humans. And that's the reason why it's so dangerous, because we don't know it's toxic. And the government doesn't know it's toxic. The government knows it's all over the food supply. They don't care. They don't even measure how much is in the food. It's like we don't care because it's not toxic. So once you think something's not toxic when it is, and then you use it far more than any other chemical, glyphosate is used in far greater amounts than atrazine as an herbicide because it's so non-toxic. It's a great
And
one to use.
atrazine is #2, right?
And
Atrazine
number
is number
two,
two.
yes,
And
and then
then
a bunch of others, dicamba and
dicamba and
2,4-D,
2,4-D,
glufosinate.
enlist, yes,
There's a bunch of
glufosinate,
them. Yeah. And I
very.
worry that even if they got rid of glyphosate, they would just roll out some of these others and make them more
Which
toxic. Because I
which
mean,
they're already doing. If you go to Lowe's or Home Depot right now, you'll see Bayer's buddy to Roundup, which is Spectracide, which has dicamba
ah,
in it. And
There you
dicamba
go.
is very harmful because it drifts. So your neighbor could spray it and it could float into your pool. And I just read a study that shows dicamba
Wow.
stays viable in the water for 40 days. So your kids are
Wow.
swimming in that.
Yeah, I
So,
know. And I,
yeah, there's lots of other
absolutely.
chemicals. But what is it about glyphosate, in addition to it like using so much of it? Isn't it a tricky chemical? Isn't it
Well,
harder
that's
to
the thing.
detect?
Well,
Isn't it
that's the
more
thing.
harmful?
It's more harmful because we think it's safe, and because it's not safe in a subtle way. So it's a slow kill. It's what I call a slow kill, because it doesn't bowl you over. So you don't get, you don't necessarily get a big stomach ache when you eat it, but it slowly accumulates in your tissues and it starts messing with your proteins. And it really, over time, it erodes your health. And then suddenly you get some horrible thing like some kind of cancer, or autism, Alzheimer's, all these diseases that we're seeing, obesity, even diabetes, kidney failure, and fatty liver disease, all these diseases, and of course, various gut problems, inflammatory bowel disease, celiac disease. There's a huge list of diseases that happen to be going up exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate usage. And everyone says, well, correlation doesn't mean causation. That's the thing that really tipped me off. I mean, I already was convinced before I knew about all these correlations that it was a causal factor in autism. And I learned that from Professor Don Huber when he gave a talk in 2012. October of 2012, I think it was when I heard this 2-hour presentation by Professor Don Huber. And I was looking for what is it in the environment that's causing this alarming rise in autism. That was my passion. It still is my passion. And I had been looking for 5 years and I'd been striking out. I could see there was a major problem with the gut in association with autism. Autistic kids have so many gut problems, bloating and diarrhea and constipation and pain, all kinds of gut problems. And I was looking for something that would be messing up their gut. And I was thinking in terms of antibiotics, because maybe they were getting too many antibiotics for their ear infections, and then they were getting gut dysbiosis. I was kind of working along those lines when Don Huber explained how glyphosate messes up the gut microbiome, causes the pathogens to overgrow, and then the pathogens produce toxic products that can mess up the brain. So those are processes that are happening in autism. And glyphosate is, I think, a very significant factor in that process that's disturbing the gut microbiome and then messing up digestion. And then, of course, causing an inflammatory gut, a leaky gut. And then also with impaired digestion, you end up with proteins that don't get digested, food proteins that don't get digested. That takes you into autoimmune disease and things like celiac disease. And, lots of different autoimmune diseases are caused by overzealous immune system that initially got tipped off by foreign proteins that did not get digested from your food.
Right. And so Hippocrates got it right when he said that all disease starts in the gut. So if you're going to mess with the gut like Roundup is and Monsanto and Bayer are doing, then you're going to be causing a myriad of different diseases. And just for the people out there who perhaps your family member has shared this video with you and you're not aware of glyphosate and where it is and how it can be found, it's on your wheat and your soy and your oats and your beans and peas if you're not eating organic, and maybe even in tiny, tiny amounts if you are eating organic, but that's only due to contamination because it's not allowed on organic food. So especially if you're eating vegan or vegetarian, those foods, the beans and the peas and the soy and the corn and the wheat in vegan and vegetarian foods have been shown to have the highest oats of glyphosate. So if you're not eating organic, you are likely consuming residues of glyphosate in almost every meal. And there's been thousands of tests done by GMO for USA and the Food Inspection Agency of Canada and Food Democracy Now! And Moms Across America and a myriad of other Sustainable Pulse of other groups that have tested, even the government as well. The United States government eggs as well is found to be high in glyphosate if they're not organic. So it's ubiquitous in our food supply, and we're talking about it because it's a systemic problem. The majority of Americans are eating glyphosate with pretty much every meal. Would you say that that's fair?
Absolutely. It's even organic. You're not going to avoid it altogether, as you said, because of the contamination from the neighbors' farms. And it's in the rain. I mean, if it's in the rain, you can't keep it out of the food.
Yeah, I mean, you could be growing an organic garden, and if it's in the rain, then unfortunately it's going to be getting your food, and that makes me too sad to even think about right now because I'm growing food. But this is something that we need to address constantly. We need to not give up on this. I love that we're lockstep in this. I learned about GMOs and glyphosate in 2012 as well. We've both been busting our butts on this for 9 years. I've
I
been
know.
working more on the advocacy side, and I've just been learning so much for you on the science side. I feel like you're an old friend, and I'm so glad to be able to see you at different panels and, you know, events and conventions and things like that to talk about it. Um, when you talk about it, you talk about its connection to so many different diseases. And when you first came out with that paper, I probably 8 years ago, or maybe, yeah, but one about 40 connection to 40 different Western medical issues. I had a talk with some major non-GMO, not non-GMO, nonprofits, you know,
Mm,
NGOs, and they would not share this paper.
right,
They said it's just too far-fetched
right. I
that
know.
Samsel and Seneff, your co-author Anthony Samsel, also a brilliant man, it's just too far-fetched that this one chemical could be associated or be the cause of or contribute to so many different diseases. They just wouldn't buy it. And this was a senior scientist at a
Right.
major, you know, nonprofit that's been working on this for 35 years. And I said, but well, what if you're wrong? You know,
Yeah.
and she said, well, I'm going to take my bets, you know, I'm going to hedge
Right.
my bets or whatever, because it's just too risky. So I said, well, I think it's very unfortunate. I think you're going to end up being on the wrong side of history on this one. And it's better to warn people and have precaution than it is to, you know, to be so cautious about it. So can you share now why is it that glyphosate, you just talked about the gut. Is that the main reason why you feel that glyphosate is connected to so many different types of diseases? We're talking kidney disease, liver disease, autism, heart problems, birth defects, mitochondria issues. Let's see, cancer, of course, leukemia, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, even urinary tract infections, and you know, a myriad of childhood gut issues. You cover all of these in your books and more in your book and
Mhm.
more. What is it the gut? Is that the main reason why glyphosate is connected to so many of these issues?
You know, I don't know. I don't think so. I think it's the starting point, and it's very devastating. The gut certainly trickles down to all kinds of diseases, but it's more than the gut. And I think the crucial thing, and this is a centerpiece of my book, I believe it's getting into proteins by mistake in place of the coding amino acid glycine. This is a very technical statement with enormous consequences. And once you embrace that idea, then you can start to see how it specifically how it could cause each one of those diseases. So basically, I started by looking at all the diseases that are going up dramatically. You know, people say, well, correlation doesn't mean causation, but I go back at them and I say, something's causing those diseases to go up. You know, you see diabetes and obesity follow glyphosate around the world. As soon as a country starts taking on a Western diet, their people start getting fat, they start getting diabetes. You know, it's like clockwork. You can see it happening around the world. It seems so clear to me now because I've looked so hard and gotten so much data. It just seems obvious to me that glyphosate is the thing in the food that's making the food so toxic. It's the primary thing. Now, of course, there's always other things, and other things are working. Actually, many of them work synergistically with glyphosate because glyphosate disrupts the enzymes in the liver that detoxify many of the other toxic chemicals, including drugs. And so people get in trouble with toxicity of chemicals that maybe would have been okay if the glyphosate wasn't there messing up their liver's ability to clear those drugs or those toxic chemicals. So
And the
there's
immune
synergy.
systems and the immune system's ability to deal with certain
Yes.
toxins or viruses. Yeah.
Well, that's so important. I have a whole chapter in the book on the immune system, and I'm particularly interested in the immune system right now because of the situation with COVID-19. I am actually
Yes.
becoming more and more convinced that we might not have even noticed COVID-19. In fact, it might not have even come about to be COVID-19 if not for glyphosate. I think it's a major player in driving the COVID-19 that the response to that virus that's so terrible that causes people
That
to
having
their
our
lungs fill
symptoms.
up. Yeah, their
Yeah.
lungs fill
Yeah.
up, they can't breathe, and uh, they die of asphyxiation actually because they don't have enough oxygen. And
Yeah.
they get on this blood meltdown too, because glyphosate really messes up the blood and the circulation. You get into a many people are in a fragile state as they age, walking a tightrope between hemorrhaging and blood clots. And this is and then as all kinds of diseases are wrapped around that, diseases that are trying to fix the blood so that it won't have hemorrhages and blood clots. And I think that that's a critical thing that glyphosate's causing is this instability in the blood. and at the same time, an inability of the immune cells to clear viruses. So glyphosate, and I talked very much about that in my book, glyphosate disrupts the immune cells' ability to trap the viruses. So when the viruses come into your lungs, the immune cells are poisoned by glyphosate. They can't trap the viruses. So the viruses are able to furiously multiply, and then they overwhelm the lungs, and then you get this enormous response. The immune cells have to start shooting the viruses because they can't trap them. It's kind of like we think about a fly flying around in the room versus one stuck on tar paper. Much easier to kill the one that's stuck than it is to the one that's flying around. So these viruses are flying around, and the immune cells can't get a hold of them because those proteins that they normally would use to trap them are not working. And they're not working because of glyphosate. And that has to do with glyphosate substituting for glycine, because these proteins, it's a whole class of proteins, very, very important in the immune system, that have what's called a collagen-like stalk. And it has this long sequence of GXY, 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 where every third amino acid is a glycine. Glyphosate goes into those proteins and replaces those glycines. And when it does that, it messes up the way that protein works. And the collagen, of course, itself is the most common protein in the body. Something like 25% of our proteins are collagen. And collagen is what is all over the joints and the bones and the skin. So it's with the glue that kind of holds your body together. And collagen depends upon those heavily loaded glycines to have the proper structure. You know, it has this beautiful triple helix structure that gives it its unique properties that make it very good cushion. So you get all kinds of joint pain, you get all kinds of back pain, and knee surgery and hip surgery. We have a mess with our bones right now and our joints. And I think glyphosate's a major player in that.
So you're saying that glyphosate messes with the collagen structure. I'm sorry, I have to mute something here. So glyphosate messes with the collagen structure and the ability for the tissues in the body to support the way the body normally functions. Mm-hmm. So this could lead to things like more heart problems, I'm saying, right? The tissues in the heart. I'm also very concerned. You mentioned Ehlers-Danlos. One of my family members has Ehlers-Danlos, and it was like, where did this come from and what happened? And I'm very concerned. He was exposed to glyphosate, and continuously for years. So you suspect then that glyphosate might be connected with the rise of Ehlers-Danlos, which is a connective tissue disorder.
Yeah, and that's actually connected to glycine mutations. People have genetic mutations in those glycines that causes that. And glyphosate just basically does a sort of pseudo mutation by substituting for the glycine. It's like having a mutation at a glycine residue. And that's one of the things I did to figure things out, is to look for articles about people who have genetic defects in certain proteins. For example, myosin, this is another good example. Myosin has something like 11 highly conserved glycine residues in it. Myosin is the muscle contracting protein, very important for digestion. It's going to help to move the digestive things inside the guts, move them down to get them out. And of course, kids with autism have major constipation problems. Their gut motility is messed up. And so everything stays up high, and you get this SIBO, you get this, infection of bacteria in your upper gut where they're not supposed to be.
Because it's not moving. The muscles are not able to move the fecal matter out of the body the way it's supposed to. So they get constipated and backed up, and they get bacteria in the gut.
That's right.
Because the muscle tissues aren't working properly, you're saying, and you're suspecting because of glyphosate.
Yes, because of the myosin. In fact, so there was a wonderful paper that talked about a specific glycine in myosin at location 699, I recall. And if you mutate that glycine to alanine, which is a very small change, you're adding one extra methyl group, which is a very tiny, it's actually the closest amino acid to glycine is alanine. If you just replace that glycine with alanine, you get 99% drop in the ability to contract. You basically kill its ability to contract. So if you replace it with glyphosate, it is dead. It is totally dead. That myosin molecule, it can't contract. And so that's going to give you this contractile mobility problems in the gut. And it can even lead to other in your other muscles too. If the glyphosate gets into them, it's going to mess them up as well.
Can they get back? Can they regain that function of the muscles in the intestines and wherever that is, the bowels?
That's the $64,000 question. I don't know. I mean, I think when you have a version of a protein that is messed up, usually then the body sort of recognizes this as damaged goods, and then they want to break it down and break it apart into its individual amino acids and then reassemble them into new proteins. So this is a process that happens continuously. Proteins get disturbed, they get broken in various ways. they get broken apart, disassembled in these lysosomes. The lysosomes are like the digestive system of the cell. And those lysosomes are able to break down, and then they'll free up that glyphosate molecule that's in there. They'll free it up. And if you're lucky, you'll be able to get it out. It could go along and go join some other protein somewhere else. So the glyphosate is constantly in your body, getting released from proteins that had it, broken proteins that had it in there, and then getting put into some new protein. So it's a constant recycling of the glyphosate into different proteins until it finally leaves through the urine or through the feces, or maybe even through the skin. I imagine you might be able to get it out through the skin or the lungs. I don't know, but so basically, once glyphosate slowly accumulates in your body, in your tissues over time. So as you're exposed to it, you get more and more. I think it accumulates in your tissues. And so things get worse and worse. And then at some point, something breaks.
Yeah, there's scientific studies to show that too. From Germany, Monica Kruger showed that glyphosate does accumulate in the animal tissues, in the tendons, in the bone marrow of animals. We've clearly shown that it can accumulate in breast milk. We know that it is in the body, and it's not just harmlessly passing through like Monsanto, the manufacturers, claimed it would. And
yes, that's right.
And so it can be accumulating, but it also can be taken out of the body. There are ways for it to come out. This hasn't been proven in humans, but I just want to give a spark of hope to our viewers that in the soil, actually, I was in South Korea giving a talk, and the doctor there, I'm sure you know him, said, "Oh, I found this study from Stephanie Seneff that she found in Africa, back in 2000, I don't know if it's 18 or something." And so 2 years later, I'm talking about this in South Korea because of you, where the study showed that this bacteria called Acetobacter in plum vinegar or certain types of vinegars actually in the soil broke down glyphosate into non-toxic components. So it wasn't the Acetobacter interacting with the soil bacteria. So I, as a precaution, take, hopeful precaution, I guess, I take foods that contain Acetobacter like kombucha and sauerkraut.
Yes,
we
have actually jars of sauerkraut in our refrigerator, organic sauerkraut. Yeah. Yes, definitely sauerkraut, and also apple cider vinegar. We use it every day practically. We have a salad. We make our own salad with apple cider vinegar, organic, Bragg's organic. I think they're both excellent. And we don't know for sure that the Acetobacter is able to break it down, but if it is, it's fantastic. And I even think that people who seem to be less sensitive to glyphosate, I suspect that they have managed to get some kind of microbe growing in their gut that's able to metabolize it, because that is such a big benefit. If you can get a microbe growing in your gut that's not toxic, that doesn't produce toxic metabolites, but that can break down glyphosate, is awesome. And we all need to do that, and we need to figure out how to make that happen.
We need to figure that out really quickly. We have April saying in the comments on Facebook that taking glutathione is great. We're not giving medical advice here, but do your research, look into it. There could be many things that can help with your health. But I want to get back to what you said about. So we know this protein issue is a major component of your book. That glyphosate, what you're asserting as a theory is that and you have plenty of scientific evidence for this. You also point that in the book. As an AI, artificial intelligence special expert, you have access. I think you said one time you could scan like 10,000 documents at a time, right? And pull the words.
I've got lots and lots of, yes, that's right. I can use computer science to process materials, just gathering a whole bunch of papers on a topic and then turn the crank on the computer to pull out connections among different words. And that gets you pretty far, actually, gets you started. So you have a
unique ability to pull all these things together. So when people criticize you for your theories, they're really criticizing thousands and thousands of documents where you have pulled this information together, peer-reviewed studies. And I just want to make sure that people, hear that, because you have been heavily criticized. So you're pulling together all of this data and information. You're coming up with this information that you compile in your book, and you have come up with this concept that and there's studies showing it, that glyphosate can substitute for glycine in the proteins. And now, can you just help me wrap my head around this as a layman? Why is that such a big deal? Does that mean that all of a sudden that every protein in our body might not function the way it's supposed to? The liver might not do what the liver's supposed to do, which is detox. My muscles might not work like muscle? What is exactly does that mean when glyphosate disrupts the ability for the proteins to work properly?
That is what it means, basically. And some proteins are more susceptible than others. And I actually developed a theory of what I call a glyphosate susceptibility motif that I talked about in the book. And that has to do with having at least one highly conserved glycine. When you see it's highly conserved, that means it's important. You see that all the different versions of that enzyme, different animals, they all have a glycine there. So you know that's an important glycine, number one. Number two, if it binds to a negatively charged molecule, especially either sulfate or phosphate. And that's because that means if it binds to a substrate that has a sulfate or a phosphate in it, that means that it's got room around that, in that protein, around that glycine to fit a glyphosate's extra piece, which is a methylphosphonate unit. So the methylphosphonate of glyphosate needs to go somewhere. So if the glycine in the protein is crowded with two big fat proteins, amino acids on either side, it probably won't substitute. So those glycines are probably safe. So you look at the different proteins and you can tell which ones. And my motif is basically a glycine that is in a highly conserved glycine in a protein that binds to a phosphate or a sulfate usually, and there's some other negatively charged molecules that could also be affected, and that has a positively charged amino acid nearby. That's also helpful because that'll attract the glyphosate because it has a negative charge. So you have all these rules. It has to have room for the extra. So it needs to have a small amino acid to the left. So all these different rules that can dictate which proteins are most likely to be affected. And when you apply those rules, then you find that the proteins that have been observed to be suppressed by glyphosate match your rules. And I talk about that in my book as well. So it's a giant puzzle, but there's many proteins that have been shown experimentally to be suppressed by glyphosate and that fit my glyphosate susceptibility motif rule. So it's kind of elegant science that way. And I love that about it. I love a mystery. I love a puzzle. And this one's really a great puzzle. And it's really caught my attention. And I've just been obsessed with it. I've read so many papers about, looking for proteins that are suspects as candidates. And it's fun because you need to see, is that disease going up dramatically? Oh, yes, it is. It matches glyphosate. Good. That's check number one, right? Oh, so this protein, if this protein is genetically mutated, you get that disease. Okay, great. Oh, the genetic mutation is a glycine. Excellent. You get that disease. So you basically build this story that fits together beautifully from all the pieces. Then you say, oh, glyphosate has been shown to suppress that protein. That's even better, right? Because then you've got direct evidence that it's suppressing it. And all you're missing is the fact that it's substituting for the glycine. And you can get that with the the EPSP synthase protein that it famously suppresses in the shikimate pathway. That's the thing people always say, shikimate pathway, EPSP synthase, that's the specific enzyme that it really upsets. It really messes up that enzyme in that pathway. And that enzyme fits my motif beautifully. It has all the features of the glyphosate susceptibility motif. And they've shown that if you mutate that enzyme to replace that glycine with alanine, the one that I think it's substituting for, if you get rid of that glycine in the code and you replace it with alanine, all of a sudden that protein is completely insensitive to glyphosate at any level. It ruins that protein sensitivity to glyphosate. That pretty much says that what's happening is it's substituting for that glycine. It's by far the most logical answer to what's going on to explain that,
Okay, so in non-scientific language, we're getting some requests to please explain, what's happening, not quite as scientific. I know that's your language, but did I sum it up accurately that if the ability for the proteins to function is disrupted by glyphosate, certain proteins this is going to happen to certain proteins and not to other proteins. It's still a mystery which ones, but you're figuring that out. If those proteins don't function properly, then does that mean that our organs are not going to be able to work the way they're supposed to? Like our liver won't be able to work the way it's supposed to? Yes? Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
And so how does that, tell us how that would show up in our body? Like what would we start seeing as far as our organs and parts not working properly? What would we see?
It's just a huge list, but I can give a nice example with the liver. And I talked about that in my book. I have a whole section, a whole chapter on the liver. And PEPCK is the enzyme in the liver that I think is really messed up by glyphosate. And PEPCK, it binds the same molecule, PEP, that the EPSP synthase binds. So it has tremendous parallels with EPSP synthase. EPSP synthase is the one we know glyphosate disrupts. PEPCK is a very important human protein, highly expressed in the liver. And if it's broken, all kinds of bad things happen. And one of them is fatty liver disease. So when you break that enzyme, you get fatty liver disease. And in fact, studies on rats, if you know this, the rat studies that showed below regulatory limits exposure to glyphosate in rats causes fatty liver disease. That's been shown. And there's human studies that show that people with fatty liver disease have high levels of glyphosate in their urine compared to people without the disease. So there's really good evidence to support the idea that glyphosate causes fatty liver. And of course, it's also an epidemic. It's going up dramatically in step with the rise in glyphosate usage. That's a clear hint that it's being affected. So that's a really nice example. And PEPCK is so central to metabolism. So it interferes with your ability to digest fats. And so that's why you start storing fats and you get fat. Some people react to glyphosate by getting fat because the ability to digest those fats is broken.
Okay, so when the body cannot function the way it's supposed to, it cannot support its own innate ability to heal, it cannot process the toxins that are introduced into the body, and disease develops. So basically, when glyphosate substitutes as a glycine, it messes with the entire, possibly the entire body, or many different organs in the body to function the way they're supposed to. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, it's a huge list. I mean, another good example is Alzheimer's, because Alzheimer's is known to be associated with this misfolded amyloid beta. I'm very, very interested in this group of proteins that misfold in association with neurodegenerative diseases. It's really quite a fascinating topic, and I'm still digging around that research field right now because I've got more to learn there. But amyloid beta, you probably know about amyloid beta plaque. I mean, a lot of people do, associated with Alzheimer's disease.
Yes.
Maybe you're too young.
Yeah, I didn't know that's what it was called, but I know about plaque in the brain.
Yeah,
Yes.
the
yes.
plaque that builds up in Alzheimer's is amyloid beta. And amyloid beta is an interesting protein. It normally would go into, I know these proteins that are misfolding are actually really important. Usually they're very essential proteins. They have a role to play that's good. And amyloid beta is no exception. So it goes into the membrane. They're not sure exactly what it does. In fact, all these proteins are kind of mysterious as far as what they do, but they do know that if it's defective, you're not viable. Lots of times when they have a genetic mutation, it produces an embryo that dies. I mean, you're not viable. So it's super, super important to the body, but they don't know how. And that's true for many of these proteins. And amyloid beta probably has some role in the immune system, but they're not clear. But anyway, it goes into the membrane normally. But if it can turn into a different shape. It's called an alpha helix in the membrane, but then it can turn into a beta sheet, what's called a beta sheet, totally different way to fold. It's critical how these proteins fold as far as to get their action to work correctly.
So hang on one second. Are you saying that when glyphosate substitutes glycine in the protein, it causes the protein to fold, to misfold?
To misfold into beta sheets. And that's pretty clear because they've zeroed in on this region. There's a name for it called a glycine zipper, GXXXG. That motif, glycine zipper, that's a motif that's a signature motif of prion proteins that misfold to cause these prion diseases or prion-like diseases, all of which are horrible. We have the Alzheimer's, we have ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, you have Parkinson's disease, and CKD, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is a human equivalent to mad cow. Mad cow is the classic prion disease in the cows. I think that glyphosate probably played a role in that as well, in that epidemic in mad cow. But these proteins have this GXXXG pattern that is characteristic signature of these proteins that have these alpha helices that can misfold into beta sheets if those glycines are substituted by something else. So when you replace one of those glycines with glyphosate, you mess up its ability to form that alpha helix because it needs that tiny glycine molecule to work to make the helix. Otherwise, it stretches out into the beta sheet. And that is a classic step towards Alzheimer's disease with amyloid beta. And I think all of those proteins, they have this GXXXG motif, that prion motif. In fact, the spike protein that's in the mRNA vaccines also has, that protein has 5 of these glycine zippers in it. And people have written about that protein being a prion-like protein with the potential to misfold into something that could trigger prion diseases. So that's really, really serious stuff. And I think all the prion diseases would be increased in prevalence in the presence of glyphosate because of glyphosate substituting for one of those glycines and messing up a glycine zipper.
Okay, and I just want to preface to our supporters who are watching who don't understand the majority of what you're saying right now. It's totally okay, but I want to say that it's incredibly important because when you can go down this rabbit hole, when you, Dr. Seneff, go down this rabbit hole and prove how it is, how it's actually like the pathway for the functioning for how glyphosate is doing this. what you're looking at is like this blueprint, or these directions, this black and white, this is how it's happening, and then the science community can no longer ignore it. So what you're
That's
doing
my
is,
hope. Yeah.
yeah, it's incredibly important. It's not just a theory. It's really showing, look, this is how it's happening, or if this is how it's happening, you cannot ignore this, and you need to do scientific, further scientific studies on this, which is, I'm sure, what your hope is around this. That there will be more scientific studies to show this. But I also want to say there are plenty showing that glyphosate is incredibly harmful right now. It should be banned from the marketplace, from landscaping, and from our agriculture system, and from communities right now. And we have on momsacrossamerica.org a blog right under the article that I just did for the review, momsacrossamerica.org/blog. The second one is our recent campaign, 5 Reasons to Revoke the License of Glyphosate Now. And we focus on the categories of babies, bees, pets, farm workers, and future generations. And even though there are hundreds of reasons, these are the 5 that we focus on right now, particularly because the new information around these different categories is stunning and shocking, and you cover much of that in your book. And for instance, and actions are being taken. For instance, the European Union of Trade Workers has recently called for a ban on glyphosate simply to protect farm workers, because they are the ones that are most exposed to it. So we'll talk more about some of the things that you can do about this and the actions, but do go to our blog on momsacrossamerica.org to take action. If you're not liking what you're hearing and you want this to stop, we need to speak up about it, and we need to call, tweet, and email the EPA. And with one click on our website, you can do that. Okay, so
I wanted to mention the endocrine disruptor, because I know you've been involved with
yes,
that whole issue of glyphosate as an endocrine disruptor. And that's an interesting story, because, back in the day when they were getting it approved, they had this mantra that, the dose makes the poison. And they said, as long as it doesn't show toxicity at a higher dose, you don't have to test it at a lower dose. And they didn't. So they didn't bother to test glyphosate at low dose back in the day when they got it approved. And it was really Seralini's paper, I think, really watershed moment, when he published that paper in 2012, that showed that low dose glyphosate over the lifespan, exposure to low dose every day for these rats, resulted in many, many diseases. But after 3 months, they still looked okay. They weren't really obviously different from the control group. It took 4 months before you started to notice damage. But by the end of their life, they had a shortened lifespan. They had a messed up reproductive system, liver damage, kidney damage, massive mammary tumors in the female rats, obviously lots and lots of problems. But it took a long time for it to be manifested, and it was low dose. And so once that paper was published, 2012, it got retracted because of pressure from the industry, and it got republished in 2014, luckily. So it still stands valid. And after 2014, you started to see researchers actually looking at glyphosate at low dose. Before, they hadn't looked. And so when you look at the papers after 2014, there's many that involve, doses well below regulatory limits, showing, effects, and in fact, in particular, showing effects in future generations. So there's some really fascinating papers that have just come out last couple of years, where they exposed a pregnant rat to glyphosate at low doses. No problem for the rat, no problem for the offspring. You start to see troubles in future generations. The children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, it gets worse with each generation. And all of that is a consequence of the exposure of the great-great-grandmother. It's really, really remarkable. That's the endocrine disrupting effects. Low doses causing epigenetic changes in the germline of the fetus that gets remembered in future generations and changes the way the animal behaves to cause disease. It's quite amazing.
yeah, and it's extremely disturbing. It's the study that Dr. Zach Bush focused on when we were able to go to the EPA. And I want to thank all of our supporters who called and emailed, because it was one of our campaigns. It was the 3rd time we were able to, or invited to, go to the EPA. Moms Across America was, and we brought with us Dr. Zach Bush, and a former DuPont scientist, a farmer from the Midwest, and a college student trying to get glyphosate, out of colleges. And what Dr. Zach Bush focused on in that particular meeting was the study that you just mentioned, that showed that F1, the first generation, was not very, it wasn't really harmed that much by glyphosate. In my life, that generation would be my father. Now, he refused to use Roundup in the pond, even though I asked him to, because I didn't want to pull the weeds, right? He said, no, it'll kill the frogs. He was smart enough, right? But his generation, yeah, he was in World War II. He would have been in his 90s today, right? They used Roundup. And then there's my generation a little bit later, even though, you know, he could have been my grandfather, right? So then, and then there's my children who are definitely affected, and their children would be the one that he said by the fourth generation, if we continue using glyphosate the way that we are, that that generation of humans will no longer be viable. I mean, we will basically be having a human health apocalypse, which is what I think we are seeing
I
today. To
think
be,
so.
yeah, and so but what was particularly disturbing about not just that, like, wow, we are headed for a massive amount of trouble, but the EPA told us that they are not legally allowed to look at epigenetic studies.
Really? Oh my God, that's amazing.
Yes, so they can't consider that in the review
Wow.
process of whether or not they revoke or renew the license of glyphosate for another 15 years. So this is just mind-boggling. Like it's
That's so
astonishing
crazy.
that our system would be that appalling. And if you want to see more about this, and Dr. Zach Bush's interview. It's on our presentations from Earth Day. So if you go to YouTube and you look up Dr. Zach Bush Earth Day, probably about 3/4 of the way through, he mentions this particular meeting with moms across America at the EPA and
Mm.
this study, and you can see all that. So I'm glad you brought up the endocrine disrupting capabilities, because again, very small amounts. In fact, the lower amounts caused more damage, is what was shown.
That's what's so
Also, Michael,
interesting. And I think
Michael
you got
Antonio.
California. You probably helped to get California to list glyphosate as an endocrine disruptor, if I'm not
Well,
mistaken.
it's in process. We're working on that. And the yes, the California Environmental the Office of Environmental Health Hazards Assessment is assessing that. And I was on a you know, on a call to, you know, really encourage them to have that put on the list as an endocrine disruptor. So they're still reviewing that. That's very important that they do that, because it's not only a carcinogen, it is also an endocrine disruptor. It also, as you said, disrupts the liver function and the kidney function. It disrupts the gut microbiota, which can lead to autism symptoms and Alzheimer's, mental illness, depression, sex hormone changes, autoimmune issues. I mean, the list goes on, and that's why this book, Toxic Legacy by Dr. Stephanie Seneff, MIT scientist, is so important. So we do hope that you will purchase it. It's available on Amazon and other places as well. But before we get into some other topics that I want to touch on, I want to go back to, you mentioned COVID and how concerned you are right now about the severe symptoms of COVID, and that perhaps we wouldn't even be seeing these severe symptoms if our entire population wasn't so heavily exposed to glyphosate through practically every bite of food. I want to read a short passage from your book that I pulled out when I was
Mm.
reviewing it. It says, in 2019, an international team of scientists discovered that antibiotics
Mm.
interfered with a signaling mechanism in the lungs that launches the first immune response to flu infection. Mice given antibiotics have a worse outcome when infected with the influenza virus. However, and this is significant, a fecal transplant from a mouse that has not been exposed to antibiotics restores gut health and increases lung resilience against the flu in a mouse that has been infected with the influenza virus. This finding aligns with the study mentioned earlier that showed that Bacteroides fragilis, sorry, name of certain bacteria, protects the host from viral infections. What does this mean? Chronic exposure to glyphosate, an antibiotic, it's a patented antibiotic, may make humans more susceptible to the flu and other respiratory infections, including COVID-19.
There you go.
So there you go. That's what you wrote in the book, making it very clear that continuously exposing our bodies to glyphosate in non-organic food, and maybe even small amounts in organic food, as an antibiotic, weakens our ability to respond to flu viruses. And we know that the corona is related to the flu virus, so, or is a type of flu virus. So, so this backs up what you just said, and I mean, can you say how crazy making did it make you to see them giving away Krispy Kreme donuts for people getting a
I
vaccine?
know. That's just like such, that's just beyond
Oh.
believable. It's just really, really wild.
And beer and ice cream.
I know. It's
I
just,
mean,
I mean, I could go on and on about those vaccines, but I won't. But I will say Bhutan, Bhutan has a very low use of glyphosate and very low infection rate and death rate, almost zero death rate with COVID-19. Bhutan, it's a country, a whole country with
yes,
no problem
they
with COVID-19.
and they're
People don't,
glyphosate free,
they're
correct? Aren't
basically
they?
glyphosate free. They're small farms. I mean, they basically don't use glyphosate, as far as I know, at all.
Yes,
Very
I
low
remember seeing
exposure.
that they're like they're an organic country, pretty
Yeah,
much.
they're the most, probably the
Yeah,
most
yeah,
organic country in the world. No COVID-19. I mean, if you look around the world, you look at Brazil and the United States, who are king. Both of them are, but really number one, number two in glyphosate usage and GMO crops, and also number one, number two in deaths from COVID-19. I mean, we've got more deaths, those two countries, than any other country. We have bigger populations, so if you normalize by population, there's some other countries that get up there with us, but all of them are heavy users of glyphosate. All the countries that are being hard hit. You look in Africa, Africa's very clear. South Africa is being the hardest hit. They've got a lot of GMO crops. They use glyphosate. Most of Africa is small farms, very little use of glyphosate, and very low death rate from COVID-19. Dramatic differences. I mean, it's astonishing. Nigeria, which has a lot of blacks, and blacks are more susceptible here. They're mostly black, right? They have crowding in the city, very high population. They have a lot of poverty. They have a lot of reasons why they should be affected by COVID-19. And even if you pretend that everybody who died is old, because Nigeria doesn't have that many old people compared to us, they have a lot, they have a large family, so they have an overabundance of young people. But if you just pretended everybody who died was over 65, you would find that for every one person who dies from COVID in Nigeria, there are 100 who die in the United States, normalized by population. It's
interesting. So are
truly
you saying
amazing. It's not like a small difference. It's 100-fold.
so?
So
And is there a lower use of glyphosate in
much less
Nigeria?
glyphosate in all of the African countries except for South Africa. And South Africa is
Yeah.
the one that's being hit the hardest. They've got the new strain too in South Africa. So, they've got the glyphosate. If you go all around the world, you can just follow the places that use a lot of glyphosate have a problem with COVID-19. The places that don't do not.
And I want to be really clear, Doctor, you're not saying we're not saying that glyphosate is causing COVID-19. We're saying that glyphosate is weakening the immune system and the body's ability to respond to COVID-19, and therefore allows for greater severity of symptoms and increased death rates.
That's
Is
exactly
that
right.
correct?
Yes, that's
Okay.
right. And so the viruses get out of control in the lungs. And then you get this incredible immune response that involves releasing a lot of toxic chemicals that are intending to kill the viruses, but also do damage to the tissues. There's so much of it because the immune cells are not able to simply remove the viruses because they can't trap them. That's what's happening
Yeah,
with the glyphosate.
so the best thing that you can do, according to this caption of your book that I just read out loud about, mice that had been exposed to antibiotics had a weaker response and were more affected by the influenza virus. The best thing that you can do to protect yourself from COVID, what I'm hearing, is to strengthen your immune system by reducing your exposure to antibiotics, which would mean not only not taking antibiotics unless absolutely necessary. I'm not sure what those circumstances would be, but I'm never taking them again because I got 2 torn tendons in my shoulders, which put me in incredible amount of pain for a year and a half due to taking a fluoroquinine, antibiotic for UTI, which I want to get back to. And so I'm never taking them again. But if people reduce the antibiotics that they're taking for different types of illnesses, they must also go organic, because if they're not eating organic, they are again introducing glyphosate into practically every meal, which is an antibiotic, and therefore weakening their immune systems. Would you
Right,
agree with
glyphosate
that?
is a patented antimicrobial agent, so it's clearly an antibiotic. And of course, it's been shown experimentally that it preferentially kills your beneficial bacteria. Lactobacillus and bifidobacteria get clobbered by glyphosate, and that allows pathogens like Clostridia and Salmonella to grow, and also the the fungi like candida, you get yeast problems because the bacteria as a whole are reduced in number, so the yeast has a chance to grow. So you get
Yeah.
really
And
trouble with your microbiome with chronic
one of our
glyphosate.
team members, glyphosate girl, Kelly Ryerson's, has had an incredible amount of gut pain and issues with her gut, and she got a microbiota test and found that she did not have a certain bacteria. I think it was one of the ones that you just mentioned. So that shows that, you know, having glyphosate in your diet for a long time, well, I don't want to say that's the exact reason, but what you just said correlates with what's showing up in her gut, because she did eat, you know, glyphosate sprayed food for quite a long period of time, and then no longer had that bacteria in her gut, which is essential for supporting the immune system. So if you are concerned about health issues, I would suggest that one of the things to do, if you can afford it, is to get a microbiota test, a test that shows what type of bacteria you have in your microbiome. It's a fecal test, I believe. And then you can take it from there. Okay, which types of probiotics do I need to take, or which type of fermented foods do I need to eat, right? How can I replenish my microbiome and improve my my body's ability to heal and support the immune system? And this is important because doctors are saying that, you know, out of that we're supposed to have 30,000 different types of bacteria. I mean, there's billions and trillions of bacteria in our gut, but 30,000 different types, and most Americans only have like 10,000. Like we're severely depleted in the types of bacteria that we no longer have, which are essential. I mean, some of them hold uh, estrogen and, you know, different types of hormones. That's something that I learned about the microbiome through your work and many people's work, that they're, you know, melatonin and serotonin and guarin, and
Mhm.
Anthony Samsdell talks about this a lot. If you don't have melatonin in your gut, in your beneficial gut bacteria, you're not going to be able to sleep well, right?
Mhm.
You're going
That's right.
to
The
lead to
gut makes a lot of the
depression or
melatonin.
bipolar.
Mhm.
If you don't have serotonin in your gut, which is stored in your beneficial gut bacteria, serotonin regulates insulin, correct? So
Mhm.
what shows up if you can't regulate insulin? It's diabetes.
Mhm.
I mean, we're talking about the essential hormones are stored in the beneficial gut bacteria. And when you have something like glyphosate destroying that beneficial gut bacteria on a consistent daily basis, we are headed for a world of hurt, people. We are
Yeah,
going
and I
to
should say that
bankrupt our
those
nation with diabetes alone if we don't watch out.
I know, but
Yeah.
those hormones that you mentioned not only are produced by the bacteria, but they're produced by the bacteria using the enzyme specifically that's broken by glyphosate. That shikimate pathway is essential for the production of serotonin, melatonin, thyroid hormone, a couple of B vitamins, um, epinephrine, which is adrenaline, and melanin, the skin tanning agent. All of those things come out of that shikimate pathway. So not only is the bacteria that make it being destroyed, but the actual enzyme they use to make it is being specifically affected by glyphosate.
So then the body's not able to make those enzymes
Yeah,
the
all
way
those
they
hormones
normally
and all those
and
regulatory
hormones.
molecules. So it's just really a problem. Serotonin deficiency is linked to depression and violent behavior. And I've wondered about that
Yes.
in terms of all our shootouts in the schools, whether that's a consequence of serotonin deficiency due to glyphosate.
Well, I'm sure it is. I've also read the book Food and Behavior: The Natural Connection by Barbara Stitt. She's a Lifetime Achievement Award winner. It's one of the first books that I read 9 years ago when I got into this. And she said she's interviewed parolees, serial killers, criminals, right? Lifetime criminals. And she said they had one thing in common across the board, and it was not their socioeconomic background. Like, right? They weren't all from you know, communities. She said it was the fact that they bragged that they lived on junk food.
Wow,
And
that's
so
amazing. That's
the
really amazing.
processed food, which not only depletes their brain's ability to have, you know, vitamins and nutrients and all that, at that time it was in the early late 90s, and, you know, the early to late 90s, glyphosate and GMOs had been introduced into the food supply. And what she didn't mention in the book, though, that was that glyphosate's a chelator, right? It also
Yes, we
holds
didn't
on
get into
to and
that, and
makes
we should.
unavailable the vital nutrients of anything it touches. So you're talking vitamin and mineral deficiency, and you're talking destruction of the microbiome of the gut, and the serotonin and melatonin, which would have somebody feel satiated and not driven to, you know, to violent behavior. And when she removed those foods from the prisons and the schools, the recidivism rate reversed. Instead of 70% of the people, you know, prisoners going back into prison, they
Mm,
stayed out and they went on to college and they got good jobs. And the kids that were dropouts, the dropouts in a school of 5,000 kids went from, I believe it was 14, no, 500 down to 14 students when they
Wow,
replaced the food with whole foods. So
that's a
when I
great
make
story.
posts, yeah, when I make posts about, looking at the food supply and people getting very upset with me that they think I'm being insensitive, saying that if the parents, had just switched the diets of these kids may not have, caused school violence. I say absolutely. I'm sorry you think I'm being insensitive, but I know this for a fact. Okay, I have to tell one more story. I think you've heard this before, but for my viewers, while we're talking about this, I had a mother who came to me who was speaking on behalf of another woman because there was a language barrier. And she said she wants me to tell you, because of our platform, that her son, and they lived in a low income area in Southern California in Santa Ana. Her son, when he was 9 years old, she knew he had mental health issues, and she had asked her school for help, and they wouldn't give it. Low income school. And finally, one day they called her and said, "Your son just told us he was going to blow up the school with a bomb and
Mm.
kill everyone in it. You have to come get him." And she said, "Well, I told you he has mental
Mm.
health issues and we need support." And they said, "Okay, fine, we'll send you to a psychologist." So they sent her to a psychologist, and the psychologist assessed him and said, "Okay, here's the medication to give him." And she's like, "That's it for the rest of his life?" And he said, "Yes. Or you can look at what you're feeding him. What is he eating?" And she said, "Well, tacos and hot dogs and whatever I can get into him." She's low income mom. I think she was a single mom. And so he said, "Well, you can look at what you're feeding them, the pesticides and the toxins and the preservatives in the food, and you can go organic, or you can give them this medication."
Uh,
So she went organic. And within 2 weeks, and did not give him medication. And within 2 weeks, the teacher said, "We don't know what you're doing with this kid,
wow.
but he is a new human being." Now, this was a couple years ago that she told me the story, and at that time, she said he is now was either 16 or 17 years old. He is old enough now to go and buy a gun at Walmart or wherever, right? And he would have been one of those kids that had shot up students at his school, but he won't be now because I found out about GMOs and toxins in the food supply and eating organic, and now he is healthy and doing well in school and all of that. He's doing great. So this is one kid who's altered the lives of probably hundreds of other classmates because he didn't go down that road. He didn't eat that toxic food. So that's why I love the title of your book, Toxic Legacy, because we have a choice to have it be a toxic legacy, or we could break this cycle and we could say, no, we're going to create a whole new future, and we are going to have healthy students and healthy children and healthy grandparents and family members, and we are going to turn this around. And that's why I'm so grateful to you and everything that you're doing. Let me just see before we wrap up. We only have a few minutes left on the hour. I want to mention this thing about UTIs. You talk about urinary tract infections in the book and glyphosate. We just touched on
Hmm.
it a little bit when talking about the gut microbiome and hormones and all that kind of stuff. Can you explain how glyphosate is connected to UTIs? And then I want to finish up my story about the torn tendons and all that stuff, so how that's connected.
Yeah,
Can you
there's
share
actually
that?
a pretty simple story on UTIs, which is a microbe called Proteus mirabilis. Proteus mirabilis is a microbe that is a very common cause of UTIs, and it is able to fully metabolize glyphosate. So I think what's happening is that these microbes that can metabolize glyphosate, when they get into the urine has the glyphosate in it, they're able to break it down. So they're actually helping to remove glyphosate from your body. They're performing a service for you, but they're causing irritation, and it's very, very annoying, and then so I think that, in fact, we've got a lot of issues with both the bladder. We have this sort of, people who have this bladder syndrome. There's a lot of people who have issues with their bladder, leaky bladder, and they have a lot of bladder pain. And then people, I think it's called interstitial cystitis, which is also connected to frequent UTIs. And it's also connected to the uterus and having overgrowth of endometriosis in the uterus. All these things are going up. And there's also this kind of um, pelvic prolapse where the pelvis collapses into it falls down basically because the structure is not intact. It's not able to hold itself up. And that's, of course, a lot of collagen getting messed up by the glyphosate. There's the leaky barriers. You have the leaky gut barrier, but you also have a leaky bladder barrier, a leaky uterine barrier. All the barriers are leaky because of glyphosate, because glyphosate is messing up the collagen. messing up. We didn't talk much about sulfate, but the sulfate is essential for maintaining healthy barriers, heparin sulfate in particular, deficient in the gut, deficient in the bladder, deficient in the uterus, deficient in the brain, and that's been linked to autism. So glyphosate, and I had talked a lot in my book about how glyphosate messes up the sulfate system, which is, again, complex, some complex, metabolism stuff that might be over people's heads, but you can read it in the book. Glyphosate is disrupting the whole system that manages sulfur. And that's part of and of course, also the collagen problem with all those glycines getting messed up. All of that is setting up an environment where things go out of whack. And the microbes are trying to help out, I think, in many cases, and they're causing disease because they're producing metabolites that are irritating to the system.
Yeah, well, so this is a new one for me where you mentioned how that certain, what is it called again?
Mirabilis. Proteus.
Yeah, that's trying to fight off glyphosate but causes irritation in our in the uterine. I that's a deeper understanding than I've had before. My understanding was that when chickens eat glyphosate sprayed grains, it causes that antibiotic resistance, and so you've got then an overgrowth of E. coli. And
yes, that's true.
And that 90%, I know Mercola, one of our friends Mercola said that 90% of the bacteria that causes UTIs comes from chicken. And what happened to me was I was traveling and it was the end of fourth year. I no longer had any organic food. So I ate a chicken Caesar salad at the airport. I hardly ever do that. A day later, I'm coming down with a horrible UTI, which I tried to fight for many weeks with natural causes, but eventually went to the doctor and got a fluoroquinine antibiotic, which they said is the
that's what
most innocuous, right? So then 6 or 9 months later, I get a torn tendon. 3/4 of the tendon was completely torn. And then I go and get, I don't know why, I got steroid shots for that. Not a good idea. I would never suggest that. And then I end up with my other tendon torn in my other shoulder. So I was in, really horrible pain for 1.5 years. And I attribute this back to that chicken at the airport with the antibiotic resistance and probably high doses of E. coli. So there could be that. There could be what you're just talking about. I don't know.
That makes a lot of sense. That totally makes sense. I mean, the microbes are just really out of whack, and I do think you're getting overgrowth of microbes that can metabolize glyphosate that are causing problems. Pseudomonas aeruginosa is another one that's a really big problem in the hospitals, and it can metabolize glyphosate. So when you look at the particular bacteria that can break glyphosate down, they're going to have a field day because they really have a huge advantage over the ones that can't, because they're not getting killed by it. They're removing it and they're performing a service for the host. But unfortunately, many of them cause disease. So, you're stuck with these nasty problems. And I think UTI is another one of these things that's become much more common lately. And I really believe it's connected to glyphosate. And if you just go on an organic diet, you will get rid of UTIs. I believe that. I've had personal experience myself because I used to get them. And once I went organic, I didn't anymore.
I've been super strict about it. I do not eat that type of food at airports, anymore at all. I make sure to bring my own food, and also I haven't been traveling very much. So, but when I eat an organic diet, I don't get the UTIs.
It's really important. Yeah, people are going to find remarkable improvement in their health, I think, if they just switch to organic. They're surprised by it, I think. And they often don't think that they're reluctant to spend all that extra money because it doesn't look that much different. It doesn't taste that much different, right? So it's hard for them to believe that it matters. That's what people need to get their mindset around, that it matters. It matters a lot to eat organic food, to stay healthy. It's super important. And you will save money in spades once you don't get some horrible disease that's going to cost huge medical expenses. And of course, you're going to be miserable as well. So
yeah, and it's not even horrible. It's not even just horrible disease. It could be autism symptoms. It could be memory loss. It could be chronic fatigue. It could just be feeling not good for years on end and being somewhat depressed because you have low serotonin levels because glyphosate's destroying your gut bacteria because you're eating hummus and peanut bread every day, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely, you're right.
Yeah, I'll never forget Health Research Institute, the scientists there, John Fagan and Larry Boland told me that one of the people that sent in his urine to be tested had very high levels of glyphosate, and they called and asked him because they were so concerned. And they said, "What are you eating?" He's like, "Oh, I eat really healthy. I eat mung beans every day." And they said, "Mung beans? They're a dried bean, and so that could be sprayed with glyphosate as a drying agent, right?" So they said, "How about you cut?" And they asked, "Is it organic?" He said, "No." And then he said, "How about you cut out the mung beans?" Within a couple of days, he retested, and he had a 50% drop of his glyphosate levels just from cutting out that one ingredient.
Wow.
So it's so important, folks, to eat organic. And thank you, Dr. Stephanie Seneff, for confirming our stance on eating organic and how important it is to your health and in being strong and healthy and being able to resist COVID, symptoms, to having a healthy heart, to, we didn't touch on all of these different things, but kidneys and livers
Read the
and
book.
being able to,
The
yeah,
book
read the
talks about
book.
these things.
She even talks about the Lone Star tick and pet food and children and Clostridia. And oh my gosh, we didn't get to the fact that leukemia and glyphosate is related to a certain fungus called Candida crucian with leukemia that can, I'm sorry, kill our children. So, I mean, there's so many very important issues that she covers in this book. And for those of you that read Stephanie's first book, I have to say that book was much more complicated to read. I'm sorry, Stephanie, but it was very scientific. It was the lovely intention, but very difficult to read. This one is much easier to understand. I'd say about 80% of it was like super understandable. And then there's only a small part of it, which was maybe 20%, maybe 15%, which I was like, whoa, I don't know what's going on here. But then you do explain it in more layman terms. So
I worked
it's
very
very
hard
understandable.
and I got help and I worked very hard
I can
to
tell you worked very
simplify
hard, and
it.
I want to thank your team, Jennifer, and your
That's right, Jennifer
publishers, and
Margulis. Yeah.
yeah, and your publishers are wonderful, and everybody that worked with you on this book. This is such an important book, and the topic needs to be addressed with every policymaker across the country. If they did, glyphosate would have been banned decades ago, or it would be at least banned this week, and we would be headed for a much safer future. So please get the book, Toxic Legacy by Dr. Stephanie Seneff. I'm just going to share the screen one more time so you can see it's on Amazon. This is what the cover looks like. And please get it today. Make sure to share it with friends and family. If you can afford to, send one to your senator, your representative, send one to your health department, send one to your food school, your school food director, whomever you can afford to send one to. Please send them a copy of this book. And with that said, anything else that you want to say before we go?
Thank you. Thank you for all the work you do as an activist. I really, really appreciate it. I'm always boasting about how great you are and how much I appreciate your work. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. We are very deeply appreciative of you as well. We appreciate your counsel all through the years, and we really thank you that you're almost always available to answer a question that we have about glyphosate, and that you continue to do such important research on glyphosate and many other topics that you're taking on. Please do. How can they follow you and find out more about you?
StephanieSeneff.net. I have a new webpage, StephanieSeneff.net, and I've been trying to write blog posts there. So periodically a new article will show up on StephanieSeneff.net.
Great, StephanieSeneff.net. And everybody, thank you so much for watching and for sharing this post, this live. We really appreciate you. And please do go to momsacrossamerica.org. We will put this up on our blog page, we'll add it to the blog that we currently have about Toxic Legacy. So if you missed any portion of this, we will post it within about 24 hours. We'll have this back up there, and you can watch it again. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Seneff. Have a great night. Take care.
You too. Bye.